Welcome, weary traveller, to a journey back through the mists of time. As you settle in for a night's rest, let us embark on a tale of a bygone era when food was not the delight it is today, but a daily struggle for survival. I am your guide, a humble storyteller, here to paint a picture of the culinary hardships endured by our medieval ancestors. Before we begin, I invite you to pause for a moment and share in the comments where in the world you are listening from and what time of day it is for you. It brings me joy to know that these stories reach ears far and wide, connecting us across the globe and through the ages. If you find yourself entranced by these whispers from the past, I encourage you to subscribe so that we may meet again on future adventures through history. But for now, let us set the scene. Imagine, if you will, a small, dimly lit cottage huddled against the chill of a medieval night. A family gathers around a meagre fire, their bellies growling with hunger. On the rough-hewn table before them sits a bowl of thin, watery pottage, a paltry meal of boiled vegetables and scraps, alongside a loaf of stale, dense bread. This is the fare that will sustain them, as it does most common folk of this time. In the Middle Ages, food was not a source of pleasure or abundance for the vast majority. It was a constant worry, a daily battle against scarcity, monotony, and the ever-present spectre of famine. The life of a medieval peasant was one of toil in the fields, of backbreaking labour to coax meagre crops from the earth. And yet, despite their efforts, the yields were often paltry, the harvests at the mercy of the elements and the whims of the nobility who owned the land. But even in times of relative plenty, the common people's diets were woefully lacking in variety and nutrition. Most subsisted on a meagre rotation of pottage, bread, and perhaps a bit of cheese or ale if they were lucky. Meat was a rare luxury, reserved for the wealthy or for special occasions. The flavors were bland and monotonous, with precious few herbs and spices to enliven the palate. And then there were the dangers lurking in every mouthful. In a world without refrigeration, food spoiled quickly, and the risk of illness from contaminated victuals was ever present. The very water they drank was often tainted with disease, making ale and beer the safer choice for quenching thirst. But even these could be hazardous if unscrupulous brewers used unsavory additives to mask the taste of inferior ingredients. This, dear listener, was the lot of the common folk in medieval times. A life of hunger, of monotony, of daily dangers in the very sustenance they depended on. But their plight was not shared by all. For the wealthy and powerful, food was a symbol of status and excess, a chance to flaunt their riches and indulge their appetites. As we embark on this journey through the annals of culinary history, we will see the stark contrast between the haves and the have-nots. We will witness the gluttony of kings and the desperation of paupers. We will uncover the perils and pitfalls of the medieval diet, and the slow march of progress that brought us to the abundance we enjoy today. So settle in, weary one, and let us step back in time, to an age when food was not a joy, but a jeopardy, and survival itself was a daily feast of uncertainty. The first stop on our journey takes us to the early 14th century, a time of unimaginable hardship and hunger, known to history as the Great Famine. The years leading up to 1315 had been marked by increasingly erratic weather, with summers growing cooler and wetter across much of Europe. The incessant rains and dampness rotted crops in the fields and made it nigh impossible to plant new ones. The harvests grew smaller and smaller until finally, in 1315, they failed altogether. The result was catastrophic. Across the continent, granaries ran dry and larders grew bare. The price of what little food remained skyrocketed, putting even the most basic staples out of reach for the common people. In desperation, many turned to foraging for wild roots and berries, or even eating the seed grain meant for next year's planting. But it was not enough. As the famine tightened its grip, the death toll mounted. The elderly and infirm were the first to succumb, their weakened bodies unable to withstand the onslaught of hunger. But soon, even the young and strong began to waste away, their bellies distended and their eyes hollow with the pain of starvation. In some regions, the suffering was so great that people resorted to the unthinkable. There are records of the starving eating cats, dogs, and even rats in a desperate attempt to survive. Some say that the hunger even drove people to cannibalism, with parents eating their children and the strong preying on the weak. Amidst this unimaginable horror, there were some who remained untouched by the scarcity. The nobles and clergy, with their vast stores of wealth and provisions, continued to feast and make merry, even as the peasants starved outside their gates. One particularly egregious example was that of King Edward II of England. Throughout the famine years, Edward continued to hold lavish banquets and festivities, his tables groaning under the weight of exotic delicacies and rich meats. He and his court consumed thousands of chickens, roosters, ducks, and geese from his estates. They drank fine wines and feasted on sugared fruits and spiced delights, all while his subjects wasted away on scraps and boiled shoe leather. The disconnect between the opulence of the nobility and the destitution of the masses was a stark illustration of the inequalities that defined medieval society. For the privileged few, food was a symbol of power and prestige. For the rest, it was a daily struggle for survival. This disparity would continue long after the Great Famine had passed. In the centuries to come, food would remain a marker of class and status, with the wealthy enjoying a cornucopia of flavors and delights, while the poor subsisted on the barest of necessities. And yet, even amidst this imbalance, there were glimmers of change on the horizon. As trade routes expanded and new lands were discovered, the variety and availability of foodstuffs began to grow. Spices from the Far East, fruits from the Mediterranean, and crops from the Americas slowly made their way into European kitchens, bringing with them a world of new tastes and possibilities. But that, dear listener, is a story for another night. For now, let us take a moment to reflect on the hardships and inequalities of the medieval table. And let us give thanks for the abundance and variety that we enjoy today, hard-won by the toil and suffering of those who came before. As we drift off to sleep, let us hold in our hearts a measure of compassion for our ancestors, who endured so much in the face of such scarcity. And let us dream of a world where all may know the simple joy of a full belly and a flavorful meal. Good night, dear friend, and may your dreams be filled with the sweet aromas of history. Let's now turn our attention to another scourge that plagued medieval Europe and further contributed to the misery surrounding food: the Black Death. In the mid-14th century, the bubonic plague swept across the continent, leaving unimaginable devastation in its wake. It's estimated that between 30 to 60% of Europe's population perished during the outbreak. The horrible, painful deaths, mass graves, and social upheaval of this time have been well documented. But the Black Death also took a severe toll on the already strained food situation. With so many farmers, labourers, and merchants succumbing to the disease, there simply weren't enough people to plant, tend, and harvest crops. Fields lay fallow as villages were decimated or abandoned entirely. The loss of so many draft animals to the plague also made ploughing and transportation of food goods much more difficult. As a result, severe food shortages and famine soon followed the plague. Even in areas that had been relatively prosperous before, the prices of staple grains like wheat and rye skyrocketed, putting even basic bread out of reach for many. Those who could afford it subsisted on meagre meals of pottage and gruel, stretching their provisions as far as possible. But for the poorest, even these unappetizing options became impossible to obtain. In their desperation, starving people turned to increasingly unthinkable food sources: diseased cattle, rotten meat from old carcasses, and even the flesh of plague victims were all consumed despite the risks. It's hard to imagine the depths of hunger and despair that would drive someone to carve meat from a festering corpse. But this was the reality for the most vulnerable in these dark times. The very plague pits and mass graves designed to curb the spread of disease became a last resort for the famished. Of course, eating contaminated meat and decaying remains only served to further the spread of pestilence. It was a vicious, deadly cycle born of scarcity and ignorance. Medieval medicine had no concept of germs or how diseases like the plague were transmitted. They blamed the Black Death on bad air, divine retribution, or an imbalance of the humours. The idea that the sickness could be spread by rats or tainted food was still centuries away. So the plague raged on unchecked, the food shortages worsened, and the death toll mounted ever higher. It must have truly seemed like the end of days to those suffering through it. The stench of sickness and starvation hung heavy over so many towns and cities. Even the wealthy and powerful were not immune, though their suffering was usually less acute. They might still host feasts and banquets, but with fewer lavish delicacies and guests as the plague ravaged the land. The gluttony and conspicuous consumption of the noble class became even more pronounced against the backdrop of famine. There are records of bishops and lords holding opulent parties even as the starving peasants outside their walls wasted away. Such callousness in the face of suffering was not uncommon, sadly. The plague starkly exposed the already deep inequalities in medieval society. It would take many long, lean years for population levels and food production to begin recovering after the Black Death burned itself out. Some regions wouldn't see significant improvements until the 16th century or later. It was a truly calamitous event in European history, a grim cap on an era already so defined by scarcity and hunger. As we reflect back on the entirety of the medieval period, it's clear that food wasn't just an afterthought or a mere necessity for most people. It was a central, driving force that shaped so much of society and daily life. The quest for sustenance was all-consuming, colouring everything from culture to politics to religion. When we think of the Middle Ages, it's easy to get swept up in the romance and pageantry, the valiant knights, towering castles, and royal intrigues. But for the vast majority of people, this was a distant fantasy. Their reality revolved around the never-ending struggle to fill their bellies and fend off starvation for one more day. It's a profound thing to consider, especially from the relative comfort and abundance of the modern world. We can walk into a grocery store and find more variety and quantity than even the wealthiest medieval king could have ever dreamed of. Eating is no longer a dreary chore, but a vibrant, colourful part of our lives and cultures. So the next time you sit down to a hot, hearty meal, take a moment to really savour it. Marvel at the scents and flavours, the freshness and quality of the ingredients. Think of all the hard work and ingenuity that goes into putting food on our tables reliably and safely. It's a privilege our medieval ancestors rarely enjoyed. In a way, food is the ultimate expression of human civilization, the culmination of our ability to shape the world around us and enrich our lives. It's easy to take that for granted, but the story of medieval food reminds us just how hard-won and precious this abundance really is, how different the world once was, and how far we've come. And there is still further yet to go, with too many even today facing scarcity and hunger. But if there is one thing the Middle Ages teach us, it is the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. So let us raise a glass of clean, fresh water or well-crafted ale to the progress we've made and the work still to be done. Let us dream of a world where safe, nourishing, delightful food is a basic right for all, not a rare luxury. And let us never forget the hardships of those who came before, toiling and struggling, so that we may enjoy the fruits of their labour today. The story of food is nothing less than the story of human striving itself, ever upward through famine and feast, toward a better tomorrow. And on that note, dear listener, I wish you pleasant dreams of plentiful harvests and restful, easy sleep, unburdened by the gnawing hunger that so defined the medieval world. May you wake to a bright dawn and a bountiful breakfast, savoring each bite anew. For there are few greater gifts in this life than a full belly and a contented heart. Good night and bon appetit. Here is the next part of the script for Why Food Sucked in Medieval Europe. Boring history for sleep. In the 11th century, a new dining utensil began to make waves among the upper crust of medieval Europe: the fork. This strange and novel instrument was slow to catch on. After all, most people were content to eat with their hands, as they had done for centuries. Forks were seen as a silly affectation, a fussy and unnecessary tool for the excessively refined. The fork is believed to have made its way to Europe from the Byzantine Empire, where small forks were used to eat sweets and other delicacies. In 1004, Maria Argyropoulina, the Greek niece of Byzantine Emperor Basil II, arrived in Venice to marry Giovanni, the son of the Doge. She brought with her a case of golden forks, which she used at her wedding feast. The Venetians were scandalized by this decadent display. When poor Maria died of the plague 2 years later, St. Peter Damian declared it was God's punishment for her vanity and sinful ways. Such was the luxury of her habits, he wrote, that she deigned not to touch her food with her fingers, but would command her eunuchs to cut it up into small pieces, which she would impale on a certain golden instrument with 2 prongs, and thus carry to her mouth. The road to hell, apparently, was paved with golden forks. Despite St. Peter Damian's condemnation, the fork gradually began to catch on among the nobility as a way to distinguish themselves from the hand-eating rabble. Still, it would be hundreds of years before the fork gained widespread acceptance. In the meantime, all manner of elaborate customs and etiquette around eating with one's hands arose. It was considered rude to grab at food with your whole hand. Instead, you were to elegantly pluck morsels with just your thumb and first 2 fingers. Licking those fingers clean between each bite was perfectly acceptable, as long as you didn't slobber too loudly. Belching was also a compliment to the chef in many circles. And if you used your dirty hands to pass the bread to your neighbor, it was only polite. All of these dainty affectations were lost on the English, who heartily resisted the encroachment of the fork and other refined French and Italian table manners. They saw eating with a fork as unmanly and unnecessarily fussy. "Why should a person need a fork to eat?" scoffed one English critic in 1611. "Once food is cut up, surely it can be carried to the mouth by hand, which God himself gave us, not by an artificial metal device." Others feared these tiny tridents as dangerous, easy to accidentally impale yourself with, if your table manners lapsed after one too many mugs of mead. The English sneered at the fork as an effeminate piece of finery for decades. It took one of their own to finally break down their resistance, Queen Elizabeth I. The Virgin Queen was enamored with forks and took to carrying a set of her own wherever she traveled. With Elizabeth setting the trend, forks slowly became more acceptable, and soon no noble table was complete without them, lest you commit a gauche faux pas. By the mid-1600s, forks had become commonplace among the upper and middle classes. Still, they remained an unnecessary luxury for the lower classes, who continued eating with their hands, knives, and chunks of stale bread to sop up liquid and runny foods well into the 18th century. Forks did not become truly ubiquitous until mass production techniques in the 19th century made them affordable for the masses. So the next time you spear a morsel off your plate, take a moment to marvel at this once scandalous innovation that took centuries to overturn the knuckle-gnawing status quo. But forks were far from the only dining controversy of medieval Europe. The very act of eating was fraught with danger thanks to the foulest of threats, the bubonic plague. While the nobility dined in style, the Black Death was a great leveler when it came to food. Of course, Queen Elizabeth's endorsement of the fork only went so far in changing the broader public's eating habits. For most commoners, utensils remained a luxury, and hands were still the only tools available at mealtimes. Proper table etiquette was the last thing on a hungry peasant's mind when their daily worry was whether they would get to eat at all. The 14th century brought that struggle for survival to a terrible crescendo with the arrival of the Black Death. This virulent strain of bubonic plague swept across Europe with ruthless efficiency, killing an estimated 30 to 60% of the entire population. The devastation was so complete in some areas that entire villages were wiped out or abandoned. One Italian chronicler wrote of the victims, "Lunch began with their bodies, dinner found them dead." Beyond the staggering loss of human life, the Black Death also decimated the agricultural workforce. With fewer hands to till fields, tend livestock, and bring in the harvests, food production plummeted. The crops that did survive were often left to rot in the fields with no one to gather them. Severe shortages and famine became widespread, even as the plague continued its relentless march. In this landscape of despair and scarcity, people were driven to desperate ends. Accounts tell of starving folk exhuming fresh corpses from the graveyards to eat the flesh. In one morbid irony, the very plague-ridden bodies being consumed may have furthered the pestilence's spread. Diseased cattle, long dead and rotten meat, and all manner of unsafe fare wound up in the alms pots and market stalls out of pure necessity. Little was understood at the time of how the plague proliferated through these contaminated sources. The few physicians that remained were at a loss to explain the plague's transmission or offer any effective treatments. Some blamed the disease on a miasma of bad air, others on an unfavorable alignment of the planets. Flagellation, bloodletting, and bathing in rosewater were put forth as cures to no avail. The wrath of a vengeful god was most often invoked as the root cause, with the sins of gluttony and immoderation among the condemned vices. There was a kernel of truth to this moralizing. While the plague was no divine retribution, it did expose the perilous vulnerability of the medieval food system. The combined blows of mass death and agrarian disruption laid bare how precarious the balance was between subsistence and starvation for the populace. In the face of such an existential threat, the old social bonds and feudal obligations began to break down. With so many dead, labour was now at a premium, and the surviving peasants found themselves with newfound bargaining power. This shift would eventually lead to improved conditions and wages for the working class, though such changes were hard-won through generations of uprisings like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. At the time, however, the immediate concern was still just getting enough to eat amidst the chaos and sorrow. For rich and poor alike, a full stomach became an increasingly rare blessing as the plague dragged on. Even the nobility felt the pinch of scarcity during these lean times, though their relative privation was a far cry from the outright starvation in the hovels. Royal feasts may have been more meagre affairs, the cooks forced to be creative with whatever limited ingredients were available, but a hungry lord still ate before his hungrier serfs. Some of the more benevolent rulers, like King Edward III of England, made efforts to alleviate the people's hardships through proclamations capping food prices and banning exports of grain. Others were less magnanimous, hoarding dwindling resources for themselves and using the calamity as a pretext to consolidate their own power and wealth. The French nobility, already suffering a series of military defeats in the 100 Years' War, became especially sensitive to any threats against their privilege. 1,356 plot by hungry peasants to loot and burn the Louvre was met with brutal suppression. Such incidents of unrest spoke to how deeply food security was intertwined with the social fabric. In the absence of a functioning agricultural system, all the old hierarchies began to falter, A king's authority meant little to a man with a starving family. The Black Death revealed in the starkest terms how the entire edifice of medieval civilization rested on the tenuous foundation of getting enough to eat. It would be many long years before Europe recovered from the ravages of the plague. A century and a half after its onset, the population was still only half what it had been before the pestilence. But in that slow rebuilding, the old medieval certainties were gradually replaced by a new world order. The Renaissance and Age of Exploration were still to come, bringing with them a resurgence of art, science, and global trade. Among other wonders, these eras would introduce a bounty of new foods from across the globe, transforming the European diet forever. But for the survivors of the Black Death, such lofty developments were still far in the unseen future. In the moment, their gratitude was for the simple grace of waking to see another sunrise, with maybe a crust of bread or bowl of peas porridge to fill their belly for the day's labours. In a time when life was so precarious and food so scarce, the greatest luxury was having anything to eat at all. How distant the lavish banquets and finicky table etiquettes of the elite must have seemed to a hardscrabble peasant in the plague years. The royal concerns over which exotic fowl to serve or which fork to use for the fish course were the height of frivolity in the face of such suffering. And yet, those elaborate customs and conspicuous feasts were in their own way also an anxious response to the ever-present spectre of hunger and disease. The Black Death spared no one, and in its aftermath, the need to savour and celebrate what blessings remained, however small, must have felt all the more urgent. Still, there's no denying that when it came to food in medieval times, the proverbial table was tilted quite steeply. For every one pampered noble nibbling delicacies off a silver trencher, there were 100 serfs thankful for a scrap of gristle. The grim business of filling one's stomach consumed much of life's toil, and all too often ended with the stomach just as empty. It's a state of precarity that is hard for many of us to imagine today, when even a pauper's diet would be a kingly feast by medieval standards. So the next time you sit down for a meal, however humble, pause for a moment to savour it, revel in each flavour and texture, and marvel at the abundance of options that surround us. Offer up a word of thanks that we can enjoy our food without fear of famine or pestilence, or some harsh lord taking it from our hands. Appreciate each forkful for the hard-won luxury that it is, and maybe spare a compassionate thought for those long-ago peasants who didn't have it nearly so good. Bon appétit! Meanwhile, the upper echelons of medieval society were as far removed from the peasant's plight as could be. Kings, nobles, and high-ranking clergy enjoyed lavish feasts and banquets that stood in stark contrast to the meagre fare of the masses. Where a peasant might subsist on a thin, tasteless pottage and a crust of stale bread, the wealthy dined on sumptuous spreads of rich dishes, exotic delicacies, and fine wines. Picture the great halls of castles and manors filled with long tables, practically groaning under the weight of the feast laid out upon them. Roasted meats were the centerpiece, succulent cuts of beef, pork, venison, even swan and peacock, glazed with honey and spices. Savoury meat pies were a favourite, their flaky crusts concealing fillings of game birds or fish, seasoned with ginger, saffron and pepper. On meatless days dictated by the church, the cooks would prepare elaborate dishes of lobster, crab and lamprey, that strange eel-like fish so favoured by English kings. Between the meaty main dishes were a dazzling array of sides, intricate moulded jellies, creamy sauces, and the ever-present trenchers of bread to soak up every drop. Baskets overflowed with fresh-baked manchet bread, its soft white crumb a world away from the coarse, dark loaves of the poor. There were pies and tarts and flans, stuffed with fruit or custard or cheese, and subtleties, those whimsical sculptural creations of sugar, marzipan and gilt, depicting castles, ships, or allegorical figures. All of this would be washed down with copious amounts of wine, mead, and ales. But the true hallmark of a noble feast was the sheer abundance and variety of dishes. A banquet for the highborn might feature a dozen or more separate courses, each containing multiple dishes. There would be roasts and potages, fricassees and ragouts, sauces and soups, tarts and tortes, compotes and confits. The aim was to dazzle and delight with the sheer opulence of it all, and to display the wealth and status of the host. One of the most famously extravagant feasters of the Middle Ages was King Henry VIII of England. This corpulent king was renowned for his prodigious appetites, and not just for food, but his banquets were legendary. A single feast to celebrate the visit of a French ambassador in 1520 reportedly featured an astonishing 89 different dishes, including venison, peacock, heron, capon, lamprey, sturgeon, and all manner of sweetmeats and subtleties. Such extravagance was not without its critics. The medieval church preached the virtues of asceticism and moderation, and gluttony was considered one of the 7 deadly sins. But for the wealthy and powerful, such pious restraints seem to have been honoured more in the breach than in the observance. After all, when famine stalked the land and the peasants struggled to scrape by, what could be a more potent symbol of privilege and power than a groaning table piled high with rich foods? Of course, even the sumptuous feasts of the nobles were not without their hazards. Rotten meat and contaminated dishes could sicken or even kill, and the liberal use of spices might mask the taste of spoiled ingredients. But the perils of the pantry paled in comparison to the very real dangers of starvation and malnutrition faced by the mass of medieval peasants. So the great halls echoed with the clatter of trenchers and goblets, the minstrels' songs and the lords' laughter, while in the hovels and huts beyond the manor walls, the common folk made do with their meagre morsels, and dreamed of a world where a full belly was more than just a rare feast day treat. The chasm between their two realities was as wide as the moat that separated castle from countryside. But even amidst the wretched food landscape of the Middle Ages, there were small shoots of change and progress that would, ever so slowly, bear fruit. Take the humble fork, for instance. Today, we take this everyday eating implement for granted, but in medieval Europe, it was a rarity and a subject of some controversy. For centuries, most people simply ate with their hands, using trenchers of bread or wooden bowls to scoop up their food. Knives were common enough for cutting, but the spoon and fork were relative latecomers to the medieval table. The first forks were small, two-pronged affairs, used mostly for spearing and serving food, rather than conveying it to the mouth. Many regarded them as a curious foreign affectation, a suspiciously dainty tool for the effete or the aristocratic. It wasn't until the 11th century that table forks began to make inroads among the European elite, particularly in the Byzantine Empire and the Italian states. Legend has it that a Byzantine princess brought forks to Venice on the occasion of her marriage in 1004, scandalizing the locals with her decadent and unnatural eating habits. But slowly, the fork gained a fork hold, if you'll pardon the pun. By the 16th century, forks had become a staple of upper-class dining in Italy, with ornate and elaborate designs in gold and silver adorning the tables of the wealthy. From there, they spread to France and England, although not without some resistance. Some English clergymen denounced the fork as an insult to God's good gifts, while the notorious glutton Henry VIII refused to countenance its use in his court. But perhaps the fork's most famous champion was Queen Elizabeth I of England. The Virgin Queen was known for her love of luxury and her trend-setting ways, and she helped popularise the fork as an essential tool for refined dining. It's said that she owned a set of silver forks engraved with her royal crest, and that she insisted on using them at all her meals, much to the consternation of her more conservative courtiers. Slowly but surely, the fork wormed its way into the halls and houses of the highborn, becoming a symbol of sophistication and status. Along with it came a whole host of other table manners and customs, from the placement of the napkin to the proper way to hold one's knife. These elaborate dining rituals served to distinguish the nobility from the common rabble, who continued to eat with their hands and share communal dishes well into the modern era. But for all the fancy flatware and fastidious etiquette, the fundamental fare of the upper classes remained largely unchanged throughout the Middle Ages. Meat, pies, and sweet treats dominated the menu, with nary a vegetable to be seen. The rich might enjoy a greater variety and quality of food than the poor, but their diets were hardly healthier. Indeed, many nobles suffered from ailments like gout and digestive disorders brought on by their rich and fatty diets. And then, of course, there were the great levelers, famine and plague. No amount of wealth or status could shield one from the ravages of crop failure or the Black Death. When the fields lay fallow and the granaries ran bare, even kings and queens might feel the pinch of hunger. And when the plague stalked the land, it claimed rich and poor alike, laying waste to castle and cottage with equal ferocity. In the wake of the Black Death, which wiped out as much as half of Europe's population in the 14th century, food shortages and economic upheaval were rampant. With so many farmers and labourers dead, there were simply not enough hands to work the land and bring in the harvests. Grain rotted in the fields, livestock wandered unattended, and hunger gnawed at the bellies of the survivors. In desperation, people turned to whatever food sources they could find. They hunted game in the forests, fished the rivers and streams, and foraged for wild plants and mushrooms. They slaughtered their precious cattle for meat, even though it meant depriving themselves of milk and dairy. And in the darkest days of famine, some even resorted to the ultimate taboo, cannibalism. Yes, there are records of starving people digging up fresh graves to eat the corpses, or even killing and consuming the living. In one particularly grim account from 14th century France, a group of peasants was caught roasting a child on a spit over a fire. Such tales may be the stuff of nightmares, but they reflect the very real horrors of a world where food was scarce and starvation an ever-present spectre. Of course, the wealthy and powerful were not immune to the deprivations of famine and plague, but they had resources and options that the poor did not. They could flee to their country estates to escape the contagion of the cities, or import food from far-flung regions to supplement dwindling local supplies. And if worst came to worst, they could always fall back on their hoarded stores of grain and salted meat, carefully laid up in anticipation of lean times. But for the vast majority of medieval Europeans, food insecurity was a constant companion. They lived from harvest to harvest, their bellies never quite full, their futures never quite certain. A single bad season could spell ruin, a sustained drought, or a spate of wet weather could bring famine, and always the spectre of disease lurked, ready to reap its grim harvest. In the face of such hardship, it's little wonder that food took on such outsized importance in the medieval world. It was not just a matter of sustenance, but of survival. A full larder could mean the difference between life and death. A hearty meal, the line between sickness and health. Food was power, and those who controlled it held sway over the fate of nations. So the great lords and ladies feasted in their halls, while the peasants scrounged for scraps. The spice traders grew rich on the yearnings of a flavour-starved populace, while the bakers and brewers plied their trade in the shadow of the gallows. And through it all, the endless cycle of feast and famine, plenty and privation, rolled on, a reminder of the fragility and precariousness of life in a world where food was never a given. Today, we take for granted the abundance and variety of our modern diets, the ease and convenience of our food systems. But spare a thought as you sit down to your next meal for the medieval peasant, huddled over a bowl of thin gruel, dreaming of a world where hunger was not a constant companion and a full belly not an impossible luxury. For in their struggles and their sacrifices, in their hunger and their hopes, we can see the roots of our own food culture and the long, winding path that led us to the bounty we enjoy today. It was a time of extremes. While the wealthy feasted on exotic delicacies, the common folk struggled to fill their bellies with even the most basic fare. The gluttony of the upper class knew no bounds, with lavish banquets featuring an endless array of dishes designed to impress and overwhelm. Kings like Henry VIII of England were renowned for their insatiable appetites and extravagant tastes. Henry's court was a constant whirlwind of feasts and revelry, with tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, savoury pies, and sugary confections. The king himself was said to have a prodigious appetite, often consuming a staggering 5,000 calories a day in his prime. For Henry and his fellow nobles, food was not just a necessity, but a symbol of power and prestige. They saw it as their divine right to indulge in the finest delicacies the land had to offer, and they did so with gusto. Banquets would stretch on for hours, with a dizzying array of dishes paraded before the guests in an ostentatious display of wealth and excess. One particularly extravagant feast thrown by Henry in 1531 reportedly featured over 60 different dishes, including roast venison, boar's head, and a magnificent pie containing a live frog, which leapt out when the crust was cut, much to the surprise and delight of the assembled courtiers. But while the nobility gorged themselves on rich foods and fine wines, the common people often went hungry. For them, the sin of gluttony was not a temptation, but an impossible dream. They subsisted on a meagre diet of pottage and bread, with little variety or nutrition to speak of. In times of scarcity, even these humble staples could be hard to come by. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, crop failures and widespread starvation led many desperate peasants to resort to eating dogs, cats, and even human flesh to survive. Meanwhile, the nobility continued to feast in their grand halls, blissfully unconcerned with the suffering of their subjects. This glaring disparity between the haves and have-nots was a defining feature of medieval society, and nowhere was it more evident than in the realm of food. While the upper class indulged their every culinary whim, the masses struggled to eke out a bare existence on whatever scraps they could find. Even in times of relative plenty, the food available to the average person was often of poor quality and dubious safety. Bread, the staple of the medieval diet, was frequently adulterated with fillers like sawdust, chalk, or even ground-up animal bones to stretch the flour and increase profits for bakers. The Bakers' Assize of 1266 attempted to regulate these practices, setting strict standards for the weight, price, and purity of bread sold in England. Bakers who were caught cheating their customers could face harsh punishments, including fines, imprisonment, or even public humiliation in the stocks. But such regulations were difficult to enforce, and many bakers continued to engage in fraudulent practices to maximize their profits. For the average consumer, buying a loaf of bread was always a gamble. You never knew quite what you were getting, or whether it would be fit to eat. Similar hazards lurked in other common foodstuffs, like ale and pottage. Unscrupulous brewers would often use cheap, potentially toxic additives to make weak ale more intoxicating, such as henbane, belladonna, or even hallucinogenic mushrooms. These substances could cause a range of unpleasant and dangerous side effects, from nausea and vomiting to hallucinations and even death. Pottage, the thin vegetable soup that formed the backbone of the peasant diet, was not much safer. Made from whatever scraps and leftovers were available, pottage could contain anything from rotten vegetables to bits of spoiled meat or mouldy bread. Consuming such fare on a regular basis could lead to a host of health problems, from malnutrition to food poisoning. But for many people, there was simply no other choice. In a world where food was scarce and often of poor quality, you ate what you could get your hands on, no matter how unappetizing or potentially hazardous it might be. Of course, there were some efforts to improve the safety and quality of food in the Middle Ages. The Assize of Bread and Ale in 1267 sought to crack down on the use of dangerous additives in beer, while the rise of guilds and professional organizations helped to standardize and regulate food production to some extent. But these efforts were often piecemeal and inconsistently enforced, and they did little to address the underlying problems of poverty, scarcity, and inequality that plagued medieval society. For the vast majority of people, food remained a constant source of struggle and uncertainty, a daily reminder of their precarious existence in a harsh and unforgiving world. Even the simple act of eating itself could be fraught with peril in the Middle Ages. Before the introduction of the fork in the 11th century, most people ate with their hands, using bread as a sort of makeshift utensil to scoop up food from a communal bowl or trencher. This practice was not only messy and unsanitary, but it also contributed to the spread of disease, as people shared food and drink from the same vessels without any means of hygiene or sterilization. In a time when diseases like the plague were rampant, such communal eating habits could have deadly consequences. The introduction of the fork, along with other table manners and etiquette, was a slow and gradual process that began among the upper classes as a way to distinguish themselves from the rude and uncouth masses. The use of utensils and individual place settings became a mark of refinement and civility, a way to elevate the act of eating from a base necessity to a social and cultural ritual. One of the earliest proponents of the fork was the Byzantine princess Maria Argyropoulos, who brought the novel implement with her to Venice upon her marriage to the son of the Doge in 1004. However, her use of the fork was initially met with scorn and ridicule by the Venetians, who saw it as an affectation of a foreign culture. It would take several more centuries for the fork to catch on more widely in Europe, with its use gradually spreading from Italy to France and beyond. By the 16th century, forks had become a common sight on the tables of the nobility, although they were still seen as somewhat of a novelty item. In England, it was Queen Elizabeth I who helped to popularize the use of the fork, after she was gifted a set of silver forks by the Italian merchant Giovanni Battista Castiglione in 1570. The Queen took to using the forks with great enthusiasm, and soon other members of the court were following her lead. But while the use of the fork and other table manners was becoming increasingly common among the upper classes, the vast majority of people continued to eat with their hands. For them, the idea of using a separate utensil for each dish or course was simply a foreign and unnecessary concept, a frivolous affectation of the wealthy and powerful. As such, the rise of the fork and table manners in the Middle Ages can be seen as a reflection of the deep social and economic divisions that characterized the period. While the nobility indulged in increasingly elaborate and refined dining rituals, the common people continued to struggle for survival, eating whatever meager fare they could scrounge up with their bare hands. These divisions would only be exacerbated by the onset of the Black Death in the 14th century, which devastated populations across Europe and led to widespread food shortages and famine. With so many people dying of the plague, there was simply not enough labor to work the fields and bring in the harvests, leading to widespread crop failures and starvation. In desperation, many people resorted to eating whatever they could find, no matter how unappetizing or potentially hazardous it might be. Diseased cattle, rotten meat, and even the corpses of plague victims were all consumed by starving people, who had little other choice if they wanted to survive. But even in the midst of such unimaginable suffering and hardship, the wealthy and powerful continued to indulge in their gluttonous feasts and banquets. blissfully unconcerned with the plight of the masses. While peasants starved in their hovels, nobles gorged themselves on roasted meats and sugary confections, secure in their privilege and power. It was a cruel irony that would come to define the Middle Ages, a time when food was both a necessity for survival and a symbol of the deep inequalities that plagued society. For the rich, food was a source of pleasure and prestige, a way to flaunt their wealth and status. But for the poor, it was a constant struggle, a daily battle against hunger, disease, and despair. In the end, the story of food in the Middle Ages is one of extremes, of feast and famine, of gluttony and starvation, of privilege and privation. It is a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the human spirit that people were able to endure such hardships and find ways to sustain themselves in the face of such overwhelming odds. But it is also a reminder of the importance of food as a basic human right, and of the need for societies to ensure that everyone has access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food. In a world where millions of people still go hungry every day, the lessons of the Middle Ages remain as relevant as ever, a call to action to build a more just and equitable food system for all. So the next time you sit down to a hearty meal, take a moment to reflect on the long and often tumultuous history of food, and to appreciate the simple joy of a safe and satisfying meal, a joy that our medieval ancestors rarely had the luxury to know. For in the end, the story of food is the story of us all, of our struggles and triumphs, our sorrows and joys, and our unending quest for sustenance and survival in an often harsh and unforgiving world. As the sun set over the rolling hills of medieval England, a peasant family huddled around a meagre meal of watery pottage and stale bread. The children dipped their wooden spoons into the thin gruel, grimacing at the bland, mushy texture. Their mother sighed, knowing this was all they could afford. A meal like this was a daily reality for most medieval Europeans. Food in the Middle Ages was a constant struggle, with scarcity, lack of variety, and unsanitary conditions making every mouthful an unpleasant chore. For the poor masses, eating was solely about survival, a joyless necessity in a time of hardship and hunger. Malnutrition and foodborne illnesses were rampant as rotten meat, mouldy grains, and contaminated water wreaked havoc on the health of medieval society. The years of the Great Famine from 1315 to 1317 were an especially brutal period. Relentless torrents of rain drowned crops across the continent. Endless grey skies blotted out the sun, turning verdant fields into swampy, unusable mush. With grain scarce and harvests failing, the spectre of starvation loomed over Europe like a reaper's scythe. Desperate peasants were forced to extreme measures to fill their bellies. Cats, dogs, and other domestic animals disappeared from villages as they were trapped and consumed for meat. The most depraved even resorted to cannibalism, with several horrific accounts of starving people digging up freshly buried corpses for food. The stench of death and decay hung thick in the air as emaciated bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. But while the poor wasted away, the gluttony of the upper class knew no bounds. In England, King Edward II continued to throw lavish banquets for his court, feasting on fine delicacies as his subjects starved. Suckling pigs, exotic fruits, and the finest wine overflowed on his table. He and his nobles gorged themselves on rich dishes as crumbs fell from their chins onto their velvet and fur-trimmed outfits. The stench of their excess, mixed with the sickly sweet smell of rotting waste, tossed out the palace windows. This stark contrast between the haves and the have-nots was a recurring theme in medieval society. The ruling class indulged in conspicuous consumption as a show of power and status, while the common folk scraped by on the bare minimum. Even in times of plenty, the average peasant's diet was dismal and deficient, based around the blandest of staple foods. In every humble hovel, the daily fare consisted of little more than pottage and bread. Pottage was a simple soup made from whatever vegetables and scraps could be foraged or spared. Turnips, leeks, and onions were common ingredients, boiled into a limp, flavourless mush in a great iron pot over the central hearth fire. On a good day, a bit of salted pork or fish might be added to the mix, but more often than not, the pottage remained a thin gruel, eaten day in and day out. Bread, the other mainstay of the medieval diet, was hardly more appetizing. Coarse and dense, it was made from a mixture of grains like barley, rye, and wheat, often stretched with unsavory fillers to make the expensive flour go further. Ground acorns, pea shells, and even sawdust found their way into the dough, creating a gritty texture and off-putting flavor. To make matters worse, the bread was usually stale by the time it reached the peasants, as it was baked infrequently to save on fuel. The staleness was sometimes a blessing in disguise, however, as fresh bread could contain a hidden danger: ergot. This toxic fungus thrived on damp rye kernels, and when baked into bread, it could cause terrifying hallucinations, convulsions, and even death. The medieval mind attributed these effects to demonic possession, not realizing the true culprit was lurking in their daily loaf. But even those who avoided ergot poisoning still faced a bleak and bland culinary landscape. The vibrant spices we take for granted today, cinnamon, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, were rare and expensive commodities in medieval Europe. Only the wealthiest could afford to spice their food with these exotic flavors from distant lands. The medieval spice trade was a booming business, with intrepid merchants like Marco Polo braving perilous journeys along the Silk Road to bring back fragrant treasures from the Far East. Nutmeg from the Spice Islands, pepper from India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, these were the currencies that could make a merchant's fortune. But for the average peasant, such tantalizing tastes were an unattainable luxury, glimpsed only in the heavily perfumed air wafting from the kitchens of the rich. Instead, the poor relied on a meager assortment of herbs like parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme to add a hint of interest to their monotonous meals. These hardy plants could be grown in small kitchen gardens, offering a touch of flavour to the endless procession of pottages and gruels. But even these humble herbs could be costly, as the difficulty of cultivation and preservation made them precious commodities. The lack of variety and flavour in the medieval diet took a toll not just on the palate, but on the body as well. Nutritional deficiencies were widespread, with scurvy, rickets, and other diseases running rampant due to the lack of fresh fruits and vegetables. The peasants' reliance on grains and legumes, while filling, did not provide the necessary balance of nutrients for optimal health. This was compounded by the unsanitary conditions in which most food was prepared and stored. Meat was often rancid or infested with maggots, as the lack of refrigeration made preservation a challenge. Grain stores were susceptible to mold, rot, and vermin, which could contaminate the precious supplies. And the communal cooking pots, used to prepare the ubiquitous pottage, were breeding grounds for bacteria and disease. But perhaps the greatest danger to medieval food safety was the water. In a time before modern sanitation, water sources were often contaminated with human and animal waste, spreading dysentery, cholera, and other deadly illnesses. The risk was so great that most people avoided drinking water altogether, instead turning to ale and beer as their primary beverages. These fermented drinks were safer than water, as the alcohol content helped to kill off harmful microbes. But they also presented their own set of problems. Unscrupulous brewers, looking to stretch their profits, would sometimes adulterate their ale with hazardous additives like henbane, a toxic plant that could cause hallucinations and even death in high doses. To combat these practices, In 1267, King Henry III of England passed the Assize of Bread and Ale, which regulated the price, quality, and ingredients of these staple foods. Brewers and bakers who were caught cheating their customers faced harsh punishments, from fines to public humiliation in the stocks. But even with these measures in place, the danger of tainted food and drink remained a constant threat. For the wealthy, however, such concerns were of little consequence. They could afford to indulge in the finest delicacies, imported from far-off lands and prepared by skilled cooks. Their banquet tables groaned under the weight of exotic dishes like roasted peacock, stuffed swan, and lampreys in spicy sauce. They sipped fine wines from jewel-encrusted goblets and nibbled on sugary confections made from expensive spices and honey. But even among the upper class, the spectre of gluttony loomed large. The medieval church condemned overeating as a cardinal sin, yet many of the clergy and nobility were notorious for their voracious appetites. King Henry VIII of England, for example, was known for his gargantuan meals, often consuming up to 5,000 calories a day, in a time when the average peasant subsisted on a mere 1,500. This gluttonous behavior was not just a personal failing, but a reflection of the deep inequalities in medieval society. While the poor starved, the rich feasted, their conspicuous consumption a symbol of their power and privilege. This divide was further entrenched by the emergence of new table manners and dining customs among the upper class. In the 11th century, the fork began to make its way onto the tables of the nobility, a curious new implement for a society accustomed to eating with their hands. At first, the fork was met with suspicion and even condemnation, with some religious leaders denouncing it as an affront to God's natural order. But gradually, it gained acceptance among the elite as a mark of refinement and sophistication. Along with the fork came a host of other fussy table etiquettes, from the proper way to hold a knife to the correct order of courses in a meal. These elaborate rituals served to distinguish the nobility from the common folk, who continued to eat with their hands from communal bowls. The act of dining became a performance, a way for the wealthy to showcase their status and breeding. But even as the upper class indulged in increasingly elaborate feasts, the spectre of famine was never far away. The 14th century brought a new wave of hardship with the arrival of the Black Death, a devastating plague that wiped out up to half of Europe's population. With so many dead, there were not enough workers to tend the fields and harvest the crops, leading to widespread food shortages and hunger. In the aftermath of the plague, the survivors were left to pick up the pieces of a shattered society. Many peasants, faced with a shortage of labor, were able to demand better wages and working conditions from their lords. But even with these small gains, life remained a daily struggle for most, with food insecurity a constant threat. As the centuries passed, the medieval world slowly gave way to the modern era, with new technologies and trade routes transforming the culinary landscape. But the legacy of those dark and difficult times can still be felt today, in the way we think about food, class, and inequality. The opulent feasts of the nobility may be a thing of the past, but the hunger and hardship of the peasantry echoes through the ages, a reminder of how far we have come and how much further we still have to go. So the next time you sit down to a meal, take a moment to savor the flavors and textures that were once the exclusive domain of kings and queens. Appreciate the abundance and variety that medieval peasants could only dream of, and remember the long and often painful history that has brought us to this point, the centuries of struggle and sacrifice that have shaped our modern food culture. For in the end, the story of food in medieval Europe is not just a tale of deprivation and desperation, but also one of resilience, ingenuity, and the enduring human spirit. It is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, people have found ways to nourish themselves and each other, to create meaning and beauty in the face of hardship. and it is a call to action, to continue the work of building a world where everyone has access to the basic necessity of a safe, satisfying meal. As we drift off to sleep, let us hold in our hearts the memory of those long-ago peasants huddled around their meagre fires, dreaming of a better life. Let us honor their struggles and their triumphs, and let us work towards a future where no one goes hungry, where food is not just a means of survival, but a source of joy, connection, and abundance for all. As the sun set over the rolling hills and lush forests of medieval England, a weary peasant family gathered around a weathered wooden table for their evening meal. The matriarch ladled out portions of thin, watery pottage into rough-hewn bowls. The pottage consisted of whatever vegetables and meagre scraps the family had managed to forage or grow, boiled down into a flavorless gruel. Alongside the pottage, the family portioned out pieces of dark, dense bread. The bread, made from coarse flour stretched with fillers like grounder corns or pea flour, was often stale and hard, hardly a comforting accompaniment to the tasteless soup. As the family ate their meagre meal in silence, they could take little joy or pleasure in it. Eating for most people in medieval Europe was an unsatisfying chore necessary for survival. The lucky ones ate to live, not live to eat. Food scarcity, lack of variety, unsanitary conditions and abysmal cooking made mealtime a grim affair for medieval peasants. In our modern world of abundance and culinary delights, it can be hard to imagine a time when food was so scarce, unappetizing, and even hazardous. But for the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages, hunger and hardship were a part of everyday life. The spectre of famine constantly loomed, and even in the best of times, filling one's belly often meant choking down unpalatable, even dangerous food. But why exactly was food such a joyless and perilous necessity in the medieval era? The answer lies in a perfect storm of climate catastrophes, economic inequality, ignorance of sanitation and nutrition, and a rigid social hierarchy that kept the choicest foods in the hands of a gluttonous few. Perhaps there was no greater example of the precariousness of the food supply than the Great Famine that ravaged Europe from 1315 to 1317. It all began with a catastrophic shift in weather patterns. After several prosperous and bountiful years, the good fortune suddenly turned to disaster. The spring of 1315 brought incessant driving rains that saturated the soil and rotted crops in the fields. The rains continued unabated through the summer, drowning any hope for a successful harvest. With granaries depleted from the previous poor harvests, the people of medieval Europe were desperately unprepared when the cold, wet weather lingered for the next 2 years, causing widespread crop failures. The sodden ground simply would not yield its usual bounty. Grains withered and died. Fruits and vegetables grew stunted and sickly. What little did grow was often too waterlogged and putrid to eat. The result was mass starvation across the continent. Food prices skyrocketed as desperate people outbid each other for what meagre stores remained. The poor, with nothing of value to trade, were the hardest hit. In their desperation, starving families resorted to eating the unimaginable. Cats, dogs, and rodents went from pets and pests to potential meals. There are even grim accounts of cannibalism, with the flesh of the dead seen as the only remaining sustenance. In the midst of this suffering, the inequality of the feudal system was put into stark relief. While the peasantry wasted away, many of the upper crust managed to weather the famine relatively unscathed. A prime example was King Edward II of England, whose lavish lifestyle carried on seemingly unperturbed by the suffering of his subjects. Even as his kingdom starved, Edward continued to host opulent feasts for himself and his court. One particularly egregious account describes a banquet held during the height of the famine, where Edward and his cronies dined on a profusion of delicacies, including roast swans, venison, and pike. The excesses of the feast were so great that a large portion of the food allegedly ended up being fed to the royal dogs. For a peasant family slowly perishing from hunger, such waste and gluttony by their rulers must have been incomprehensible. The Great Famine laid bare the vast chasm between the haves and have-nots in medieval society. It's estimated that between 10 to 25% of the population of cities and towns died during the Great Famine. No one knows how many rural poor perished, but it was likely a much higher percentage. The famine was an extreme example of the hardships of the age, but it was by no means the only time that common people struggled to fill their bellies. Even in years without famine, the typical peasant diet was appallingly deficient in both nutrition and flavour. A major culprit for the monotony and blandness of medieval cuisine was the lack of spices and herbs. Today, we take for granted the dazzling array of seasonings available to us to punch up a boring dish. But back then, most people had access to little beyond local weeds and the occasional bitter herb. The vast majority of the flavourful spices we now consider commonplace, like black pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and cloves, originated in the Far East. In medieval Europe, these tantalising tastes from abroad were rare, expensive luxuries far beyond the means of the average person. The spice trade, still in its infancy during the Middle Ages, was a slow, arduous affair. Intrepid merchants like the famed Venetian explorer Marco Polo undertook epic voyages along the Silk Road to bring these exotic Eastern flavours to European markets. The long, hazardous journey and scarcity of the spices meant that only the wealthiest could afford them. Royals and upper nobility would shell out shocking sums for spices to enliven their feasts. Saffron, for example, worth more than its weight in gold, might be used with abandon in the dishes of the rich, while a peasant family may never taste it in their lifetime. Spices became an important status symbol, a sign of affluence and prestige that set the upper class apart. The desire for these rare and valuable commodities gave rise to guilds of spicerers and pepperers, tradesmen who dealt exclusively in the spice market. These professional spice merchants held great power and influence, controlling the flow of flavours into the coffers of the rich. One such spice aficionado was King Edward I of England, who was known for his love of expensive spices. During his reign in the late 13th century, Edward's royal household blew through spices at an astonishing rate. Records show that the royal kitchens went through several pounds of spices like mace, caraway, and cardamom every single day. To put that in perspective, a skilled tradesman of the time would have to work for a year to afford a pound of the cheapest spices. The extravagance was so great that Edward eventually had to issue a proclamation attempting to rein in the reckless spending on seasonings. Meanwhile, the serf toiling in the fields could only dream of such luxuries as he supped on his daily pottage. Pottage, a thin vegetable soup, was the cornerstone of the peasant diet. The recipe was simple. Toss whatever vegetables and scraps could be had into a cauldron of boiling water and wait. Since most serfs grew the same few staple crops, barley, onions, peas, beans, and turnips, on their lord's land, pottage tended to be a rather drab and tasteless affair. The truly unlucky might even find themselves eating a famine pottage of foraged weeds and tree bark. A far cry from a fragrant curry or zesty stew, pottage was more grim fuel than enjoyable fare. The other mainstay of the medieval peasant diet was bread, and often bad bread at that. Wheat was an expensive commodity, so most bread was made from lower quality grains like rye or barley. To stretch the meagre flour supply even further, bakers would cut the meal with fillers like ground peas, acorns, or even sawdust and chalk. The result was bread that was dense, coarse, and often rife with contaminants. It wasn't uncommon for the bread to be mouldy or infested with worms and insects. But for many, even foul bread was better than no bread at all. Those who could afford it would purchase their bread from professional bakers, but they too were at the mercy of unscrupulous purveyors. The problems with substandard bread became so widespread that in 1266, King Henry III of England enacted the Assize of Bread and Ale, a law that regulated the price, weight, and quality of bread sold by bakers. Bakers who were caught cheating their customers by selling underweight or adulterated loaves were subject to harsh fines or even corporal punishment. In one infamous case, a baker in London was caught selling bread that contained ground peas, beans, and vetches instead of pure wheat flour. As punishment for his deception, the baker was dragged through the streets of the city with the offending loaf of bread hung around his neck before being pilloried and fined a hefty sum. But even with the threat of such consequences, many bakers continued to cut corners and cheat their customers. For the poor who depended on bread as a staple food, this could have disastrous consequences. Eating mouldy or contaminated bread could lead to serious illness and even death. If bread was a risky proposition, then drinking was an even more perilous affair in medieval times. Clean drinking water was a rarity, as most water sources were contaminated with sewage and waste. As a result, ale and beer were the most common beverages, consumed by everyone from children to the elderly. But just as with bread, the ale of the time was often far from pure or wholesome. Unscrupulous brewers would often stretch their product with cheaper, sometimes hazardous ingredients. One popular additive was henbane, a toxic plant that when consumed in ale would produce feelings of intoxication and hallucination. Other common adulterants included more benign ingredients like eggs, rushes, or roasted apples, but some brewers would even resort to adding things like chalk, sawdust, or poisonous darnel seed to increase profits. The use of these questionable additives was so widespread that in 1487, authorities in England passed the first law regulating the purity of ale. The dangers of contaminated ale were well known, even if the exact causes were not. In 1375, the London poet William Langland penned a cautionary tale in his work, Piers Plowman, about a group of gluttons who indulged in too much perilous ale. And then glutton goes to sleep, and the fire catches his guts. He pisses a gallon in the space of a mile, and blows his loud horn at his backside, and buffets his buttocks as though they were drums. Graphic scatological humour aside, Langland's verse highlights the very real risk of falling ill from contaminated ale. With no knowledge of microbes or sanitation, drinkers were at the mercy of the integrity of their brewers. But while the poor guzzled dubious homebrews, the upper echelons enjoyed a very different drinking experience. The wealthy could afford to import fine wines from France and Italy, or sip on mead made from expensive honey. They even had the luxury of adding spices to their wine in a precursor to modern mulled wine. This disparity between the haves and have-nots extended to all aspects of food culture in the Middle Ages. While the peasantry subsisted on a diet of gruel, bad bread, and tainted ale, the nobility indulged in lavish feasts with all the trappings of exotic ingredients and fine dining. A typical banquet for the upper classes would have been a sight to behold, with dozens of elaborate dishes served in numerous courses. Roasted meats like venison, boar, and swan were popular centerpieces, often seasoned with precious imported spices and presented in dramatic decorative fashions. Other delicacies might include dishes like roast peacock, served in its own colourful plumage, or lampreys, jawless fish that were considered a particular treat. Sweets and desserts were also an important part of the feast, with dishes like quince tarts, marchpane, a type of marzipan, and figgy pudding rounding out the meal. All of this opulence was in stark contrast to the meagre rations of the lower classes. While a peasant family might subsist on a few pounds of bread and a pot of vegetable scraps for a week, a noble household could easily blow through several £100 of meat and gallons of wine in a single feast. This gluttony was not just a privilege of the upper classes, but was seen as a symbol of their power and prestige. Kings and nobles would often host grand feasts as a way to show off their wealth and curry favor with their subjects. Refusing an invitation to such a feast was considered a grave insult. One of the most infamous examples of royal excess was King Henry VIII of England, who was renowned for his voracious appetite and love of fine dining. Henry's lavish banquets were the stuff of legend, with contemporary accounts describing tables groaning under the weight of countless dishes. A typical meal for Henry might include dozens of different types of meat, from venison and boar to peacock and swan, all seasoned with expensive, imported spices. He was also particularly fond of sweet dishes, and his cooks were known to create elaborate sugar sculptures and marzipan figures to decorate his feasts. But Henry's gluttony came at a cost. As he aged, his weight ballooned, and he began to suffer from a host of health problems, including gout, diabetes, and ulcerated legs. By the end of his life, he was so obese that he had to be winched onto his horse with a special mechanical device. Despite the cost to his health, Henry's love of food was seen as a sign of his power and virility. Gluttony, after all, was considered a sin only for the poor. For the rich and powerful, it was simply a perk of their station. But even as the nobility gorged themselves on fine foods, they began to develop a sense of refinement and table manners that set them apart from the lower classes. One of the most important innovations in this regard was the introduction of the fork. Before the 11th century, most people in Europe ate with their hands, using bread as a sort of edible utensil to scoop up food. Knives were used for cutting meat, but forks were virtually unknown. That began to change in the 11th century when forks started to appear in the Byzantine Empire. The use of forks slowly spread to Italy, where they became popular among the wealthy merchant class. By the 14th century, forks had made their way to France, where they were initially met with some resistance. Some clergy even denounced them as an affront to God, who had already provided humans with perfectly good natural utensils in the form of their hands. But despite this initial backlash, the use of forks continued to spread throughout Europe, becoming an important symbol of refinement and civility. By the 16th century, forks were a common sight at the tables of the nobility, who used them to delicately spear and convey food to their mouths. The adoption of the fork was just one aspect of the increasingly complex table manners that developed among the upper classes during the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Etiquette books like Erasmus of Rotterdam's De Civilitate Morum Puerilium, on the civility of children's manners, laid out detailed rules for proper dining behavior. Children of noble families were instructed on everything from how to hold a knife and fork to how to properly use a napkin. They were taught to take small bites, chew with their mouths closed, and avoid slurping or smacking their lips. Burping, spitting, or blowing one's nose at the table were strictly forbidden. All of these rules and customs served to differentiate the nobility from the peasantry, who continued to eat with their hands and observe few, if any, table manners. Dining became a performance, a way for the upper classes to display their wealth, taste, and refinement. But even as the nobility enjoyed their elaborate feasts and fancy table manners, the spectre of famine and food scarcity continued to haunt medieval Europe. Perhaps no event illustrates this better than the Black Death, the devastating plague that swept across the continent in the 14th century. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, likely carried by fleas on the backs of rats that hitched a ride on merchant ships from Asia. The disease spread like wildfire, moving from port cities to the countryside, killing indiscriminately along the way. By the time the worst was over, an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's population had perished. The effects of this massive population decline on the food supply were complex and far-reaching. On the one hand, with fewer mouths to feed, there was theoretically more food to go around for the survivors. Wages for labourers also increased, as the shortage of workers gave them more bargaining power. But the plague also disrupted the delicate balance of medieval agriculture. With so many farmers and labourers dead, there was no one to tend the fields or bring in the harvests. Crops rotted in the ground, and livestock wandered off or died. The result was widespread food shortages and famine, even in areas that had been relatively spared by the plague. To make matters worse, the plague was often spread through contaminated food sources. Fleas from infected rats could easily make their way into grain stores, spreading the disease to unsuspecting consumers. Diseased cattle, too weak to resist the infection, could pass the plague on to humans through their meat or milk. In their desperation, people resorted to eating all sorts of unsafe and unpalatable foods. Accounts from the time describe people eating rotten meat, dice. Let us return now to the opulent feasts of the wealthy and highborn in medieval Europe. While the lowly peasants subsisted on thin pottages and stale crusts, the nobility gorged themselves on sumptuous banquets featuring all manner of exotic delicacies. Imagine a grand hall lit by flickering torches and massive fireplaces. Long wooden tables groan under the weight of countless dishes. At the head table, a portly lord tears into a roast swan, fatty juices dribbling down his many chins. He chews noisily, smacking his lips, as a servant hastily replaces the bird with an even rarer treat, a roast peacock, its colourful plumage painstakingly replaced after cooking. The ladies and gentlemen seated at the high table reach greedily for the choicest morsels. They slurp down oysters and mussels. They crunch into lampreys, jawless eel-like fish that were a particular favourite of the English kings. Henry I was said to have died from eating a surfeit of lampreys. One can only imagine the gastric distress caused by such a slimy meal. But the real showstopper of the medieval feast was undoubtedly the subtlety. These were elaborate creations of sugar, marzipan and pastry, crafted into fanciful designs. A popular subtlety was the cockentrice, the front half of a capon sewn onto the back of a piglet, then roasted and gilded. The effect was a disturbing hybrid creature, but the lords and ladies marvelled at the artistic spectacle even as they devoured its flesh. As the feast progressed and the wine flowed freely, inhibitions lowered and behaviour grew unruly. Diners wiped their greasy hands on the tablecloth or their neighbours' sleeves. They gnawed on bones and tossed the scraps to the dogs fighting under the tables. Loud belches were a sign of appreciation to the host. The gluttonous excess on display was staggering. Records show one feast given by the Earl of Warwick in 1470 included 14 oxen, 12 pigs, 140 sheep, and 1,300 eggs among countless other delicacies. The nobility justified such consumption by claiming they needed more nourishment to fuel their superior bodies and minds. Gluttony was a forgivable sin among the powerful. Perhaps no one embodied this mindset more than King Henry VIII. The tyrannical ruler was renowned for his enormous appetites and his enormous waistline. In his youth, Henry had been a trim and handsome man. But by mid-life, the king's suit of armour required a 54-inch waist to accommodate his growing girth. His suits had to be let out repeatedly as his weight ballooned. What fueled Henry's expansion? A typical day of meals for the king was recorded in one of his royal palaces. For breakfast, he consumed a relatively modest spread of ale, bread, and fish. But the rest of the day more than compensated. At 10 a.m., Henry sat down for his main meal. He'd start with pottage, to be sure, but then moved on to heartier fare. Hare, pheasant, venison, all were regularly on the menu, washed down with plenty of ale and wine. Beef was a particular favourite of the king. One year, the royal kitchen at Hampton Court Palace went through 8,200 sheep and 2,330 deer to satisfy his cravings. A few hours after the midday meal, Henry would call for a snack, This could be a meat pie, a sweet custard, or one of his beloved marrow pies filled with rich bone jelly. For dinner, another full meal was served. More meat, more puddings, more ale. It's estimated the king took in around 5,000 calories per day. Combined with his waning physical activity, it was a recipe for severe obesity. As Henry's weight climbed, so too did his health problems. He suffered from painful gout, swollen legs, and likely type 2 diabetes. By the time of his death, the king's mobility was severely limited. His enormous coffin required 16 yeomen from his guard to carry it. In the end, Henry VIII's colossal appetites had become his downfall. But Henry was far from the only noble whose eyes were bigger than his stomach. Across Europe, the upper classes took full advantage of their privilege to eat in excess while the peasants starved. Nowhere was this gross inequity on better display than at the lavish banquets hosted by the nobility. One of the most famous such feasts was the wedding celebration of Duke Philip the Good in 1369. This week-long affair featured all manner of culinary wonders. There were pies filled with songbirds that would burst forth from the crust when sliced, stunning diners with their trilling melodies. An elaborate sculpture crafted from marzipan, gold leaf, and jewel-like sugarwork formed the stunning centerpiece. Whole roast pigs and piles of wild game flanked it. Perhaps most astonishing was the food entertainment offered between the many courses. A giant hollow pie was wheeled out before the guests. When the crust was cut, out leapt a flock of live turtle doves that flew around the hall. Next came a roast swan, carrying a lighted taper in its beak, followed by a peacock that had been skinned, cooked, and then redressed in its feathers. Such awe-inspiring dishes were designed to delight the eye as much as the palate. In fact, they were more akin to culinary illusions or magic tricks than actual sustenance. The goal was to incite wonder and applause, to provide a spectacle that would live on in the memories of the noble guests. Of course, putting on such a show took immense manpower behind the scenes. Downstairs in the kitchens, lowly scullery maids and turnspits toiled for days to prepare the complicated delicacies. They hauled water, plucked fowl, rolled pastry, and glazed subtleties to bedeck the banquet tables. The work was hot, grueling, and unending. As one course was devoured above, the servants rushed to lay out another. The air hung thick with smoke from the great spits perpetually turning over the fires. The stench of grease and offal permeated everything. And at the end of the night, the unlucky kitchen wenches faced a mountain of bones and detritus that required hours to clear away. All so the nobility could enjoy another night of bacchanalian excess. So it went for the serving class in medieval Europe. Whether you were a kitchen drudge or a lowly peasant in the fields, food was not a joy, but a series of unpleasant burdens and hard sacrifices. For every lord smacking his lips over a lark-tongue pottage, 100 hungry serfs choked down yet another rancid barley gruel. Part 4. The adulteration of ale. In a world where clean water was a rarity, ale and beer reigned as the drinks of choice for most medieval Europeans. Much like bread, ale was an essential source of nutrition, providing crucial calories to the working class. It was consumed by all ages and at all times of day, from breakfast to bedtime. A 15th century saying even advised bread and ale for the working man, bread and milk for the young, and wine for the elderly. But just as bakers would often stretch their dough with questionable fillers, brewers too were known to adulterate their ale with unsavory additives. Unscrupulous alehouses would use anything from tree bark to soot to darken weak, watery brews and make them appear more robust. More nefariously, some would even add hallucinogenic herbs like henbane to give their ale an extra kick and keep customers coming back for more. The use of henbane was particularly insidious. Also known as stinking nightshade, this poisonous plant would give ale a bitter taste and induce a stupor in the drinker. In mild doses, It could cause restlessness, hallucinations, and a feeling of flight, perhaps a welcome escape from the hard realities of medieval life for some. But in higher concentrations, it could lead to coma-like sleep, madness, and even death. As ale was often served in dark, smoky taverns, where the colour and clarity were difficult to judge, the hapless medieval drinker had little way of knowing the quality or purity of his pint. As you might imagine, this led to some rather rowdy and raucous behaviour in your average alehouse, to say nothing of the next day miseries of headache, nausea, and other mysterious maladies. But as these practices grew more widespread and egregious throughout the 13th century, authorities began to take notice. In England, the 1267 Assize of Bread and Ale cracked down on deceptive and dangerous brewing practices. Ale tasters were appointed in every town to test the quality and strength of ale, levying hefty fines or even imprisonment on brewers found guilty of adulteration. The Worshipful Company of Brewers, established in London in the 15th century, further sought to regulate the trade. Strict rules were put in place on everything from the prices alehouses could charge to the hours they could operate. Slowly but surely, the quality and safety of ale began to improve. But in an age before sanitation, pasteurization, and food safety laws, the medieval drinker still imbibed at his own risk. So, the next time you sip a cold, clean pint of beer, take a moment to appreciate how far brewing has come from its murky medieval origins. And maybe spare a thought for your distant ancestors, who lived and drank in a time when a simple sup of ale could mean the difference between a good night's sleep and a nightmare-fueled stupor. It's enough to make you grateful for the FDA, isn't it? Part 5. The gluttony of the upper class. While the average peasant subsisted on a meagre diet of pottage, bread, and the occasional bit of ale or cheese, the medieval upper crust enjoyed a very different sort of fare. For the nobility and high-ranking clergy, food was not just sustenance, but a symbol of wealth, power, and prestige, and they were not shy about flaunting it. Grand feasts were a hallmark of medieval aristocratic life, often lasting for days and featuring a dizzying array of dishes. A typical banquet might include dozens of courses, from savoury meats like roast boar, venison, and swan, to sweet delicacies like marchpane, shortbread, and subtleties. Elaborate sugar sculptures depicting castles, ships, or biblical scenes. One particularly ostentatious dish was the cockentrace, a fanciful creation that joined the upper half of a pig to the bottom half of a turkey, stitched together and roasted. Another was the figgy pudding, a dense cake studded with figs, dates, and spices, and drenched in brandy before being set aflame. Lampreys, a type of jawless fish, were also prized for their rich flavour and luxurious texture. But perhaps no one embodied the excess and gluttony of the medieval upper class quite like King Henry VIII of England. Known for his enormous appetites in all areas of life, Henry's legendary feasts were orgies of indulgence. His cooks would prepare up to 14 dishes per course, with a total of 7 courses served throughout the day. For breakfast alone, Henry would consume a staggering 5,000 calories, washing down plates of mutton, chicken, and beef, with a gallon or more of ale. Dinner was an even more extravagant affair, often featuring exotic delicacies like grilled beaver's tails, whole roasted peacocks, and lamprey pie, a dish so rich and coveted that it was actually outlawed for commoners. All of this overindulgence took a toll on Henry's health. By the end of his reign, he weighed nearly 400 pounds and suffered from painful gout, likely brought on by his extreme eating habits. But as a king, Henry's gluttony was not just tolerated, but celebrated as a symbol of his power and virility. For the lower classes, however, the sin of gluttony was harshly judged. Medieval society viewed overeating as a moral failing, a sign of weak character and lack of self-control. Gluttons were often depicted in art and literature as pigs, their bellies distended and their eyes glazed over in a food-induced stupor. The church also played a role in condemning gluttony, with many religious leaders preaching the virtues of fasting and moderation. Yet at the same time, high-ranking clergy were often among the worst offenders when it came to overindulgence. Wealthy bishops and abbots would throw lavish feasts that rivaled those of the nobility, leading to charges of hypocrisy and corruption. So while the medieval peasant went hungry, the upper classes gorged themselves on rich, exotic foods, their gluttony excused and even celebrated as a mark of their status. It was a stark reminder of the deep inequalities that pervaded medieval society, where even basic sustenance was yet another luxury reserved for the privileged few. As we drift off to sleep, bellies full from our modern-day meals, it's hard to imagine the hunger and hardship that defined life for so many in the Middle Ages. But perhaps we can take a moment to savor and appreciate the simple joy of a nourishing, fulfilling meal, a joy that our medieval ancestors, high and low alike, could only dream of. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and bon appetit. Part 6. The Rise of the Fork and Table Manners. Imagine, if you will, a grand medieval banquet hall, teeming with lords and ladies in their finest attire. The tables are laden with a sumptuous feast, roasted meats, savoury pies, candied fruits and nuts. But amidst all the finery and delicacies, there is one notable absence, the fork. For most of the Middle Ages, the fork was a rarity, viewed as a strange and even suspicious implement. Most people simply ate with their hands, using a knife to spear meat and a spoon for soups and stews. Table manners, as we know them today, were virtually non-existent. Diners would reach across the table to grab morsels from communal platters, wiping their greasy fingers on their clothes or the tablecloth. The fork, however, had been around since ancient times, used by the Greeks and Romans for particular dishes. But it wasn't until the 11th century that this peculiar utensil made its way to Europe, brought back by a Byzantine princess who shocked Venice by using a two-pronged golden fork to eat. Her dainty table manners were viewed as a sign of decadence and even sacrilege. After all, didn't God give us fingers to eat with? But slowly, very slowly, the fork began to catch on among the upper classes as a way to distinguish themselves from the riffraff. By the 16th century, ornate forks made of silver and gold started appearing on the tables of the nobility, often adorned with precious gems and elaborate engravings. Using a fork became a sign of refinement and good breeding, a way to show off one's wealth and status. One notable early adopter of the fork was Queen Elizabeth I of England. The Virgin Queen was known for her impeccable table manners, delicately spearing her food with a jewel-encrusted fork and dabbing at her lips with a linen napkin. Her court followed suit, and soon the fork became a must-have accessory for any self-respecting noble. But it wasn't just the fork that set the upper classes apart. A whole host of fussy table etiquettes emerged in medieval courts, from the proper way to cut one's meat to the correct order in which to eat one's dishes. In the court of King Louis XIV of France, diners were expected to follow an elaborate set of rules, including never touching the food with one's fingers, never slouching or putting one's elbows on the table, and never, ever blowing on one's soup to cool it down. These strict table manners served as a way to enforce social hierarchies and keep the lower classes in their place. For a commoner to eat with a fork or to follow the intricate rules of courtly dining would have been seen as an affront to the natural order, a dangerous blurring of the lines between high and low. So the next time you sit down to a meal and reach for your trusty fork, take a moment to appreciate this humble utensil's long and winding history. From a scandalous Byzantine import to a symbol of refinement and class, the fork has come a long way in shaping our modern eating habits. And while we may not follow the fussy etiquette of medieval courts, we can still savour the simple pleasure of a well-mannered meal. No fingers required. As we settle into our cosy beds, safe from the hunger and hardship of the Middle Ages, let us dream of grand feasts and glittering banquets, where lords and ladies dine in splendor, and even the lowliest peasant has a fork to call his own. Good night, dear listener, and sweet dreams of a world where every meal is a celebration, and every bite a little taste of history. Part 7. The Plague Years and Food Shortages. But alas, not all was feast and finery in the Middle Ages. For as much as the upper classes indulged in their lavish banquets and fancy table manners, the spectre of hunger and disease was never far behind. And never was this more true than during the dark days of the Black Death. The year was 1347, and a ship docked in the Sicilian port of Messina, carrying with it a deadly cargo. The sailors on board were covered in strange black boils that oozed blood and pus. Within days, the disease had spread to the city and soon to the rest of Europe, carried by fleas on the backs of rats. The Black Death, as it came to be known, was a pandemic of unimaginable proportions. Over the course of just 4 years, it wiped out an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's population, leaving entire villages abandoned and fields untended. It was a time of unimaginable horror and suffering, with many believing that the end of days had truly arrived. As the plague ravaged the countryside, food shortages quickly followed. With so many peasants sick or dead, there was no one to tend the crops or care for the livestock. Grain rotted in the fields, dairy cows went unmilked, and meat spoiled without anyone to salt or smoke it for preservation. Those who survived the initial outbreak often found themselves facing an even slower, more painful death from starvation. Desperate people resorted to eating anything they could find, from diseased cattle to rotten meat crawling with maggots. There were even reports of cannibalism, with starving villagers digging up the recently dead to fill their empty bellies. In the cities, the situation was even more dire. As the wealthy fled to their country estates, the poor were left to fend for themselves in the filthy, overcrowded slums. Food prices skyrocketed as supplies dwindled, and many were forced to subsist on little more than bread and water. The stench of death and decay filled the air as corpses piled up in the streets faster than they could be carted away. But even in the midst of such unimaginable tragedy, there were glimmers of hope and resilience. Monasteries and churches stepped up to provide what little food and comfort they could, opening their doors to the sick and the starving. In some villages, survivors banded together to share what meager resources remained, pooling their crops and livestock for the common good. And through it all, the human spirit endured. People found solace in their faith, in their families, and in the simple joys of a warm meal and a full belly. They told stories and sang songs to keep their spirits up, even as the world seemed to crumble around them. And slowly, painfully, life began to return to a new normal. The Black Death left an indelible mark on medieval society, one that would reverberate for generations to come. It forever changed the balance of power between the rich and the poor, as the sudden scarcity of labor gave peasants newfound bargaining power. It also spurred a wave of religious fervor, as many sought to make sense of the senseless suffering through prayer and penance. But perhaps most importantly, the plague years taught us the fragility of life and the preciousness of the simple things we so often take for granted: a warm meal, a loving family, a safe place to lay our heads at night. It is a lesson that echoes through the centuries, reminding us of the resilience and strength of the human spirit in the face of even the darkest of times. So as we drift off to sleep, let us hold fast to that spirit of hope and perseverance. Let us dream of a world where every person has enough to eat, where every meal is a celebration of life and love and community. And let us wake with a renewed appreciation for the simple joys and blessings that surround us, even in the midst of hardship and uncertainty. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be sweet and your belly always full, and may the lessons of the past light our way towards a brighter, more nourishing future for all. Conclusion. As our journey through the annals of medieval food draws to a close, we are left with a bittersweet taste in our mouths. For most people living in the Middle Ages, eating was not a joyous occasion, but a daily struggle against hunger, disease, and scarcity. From the bland pottages and mouldy bread of the peasants to the adulterated ales and rancid meats of the plague years, food was more often a source of suffering than of sustenance. And yet, even in the darkest of times, there were glimmers of light and humanity. The exotic spices that brightened up a monotonous diet, the grand feasts that celebrated life's milestones, the rise of the fork and table manners as a sign of civilization and progress. These small joys and triumphs remind us of the enduring human spirit, of our ability to find beauty and meaning even in the most challenging of circumstances. Today, we live in a world of unimaginable abundance and variety when it comes to food. We can savor cuisines from every corner of the globe, indulge in once rare delicacies like chocolate and coffee, and enjoy meals that are safe, sanitary, and satisfying. It is a privilege that our medieval ancestors could scarcely have dreamed of, and one that we should never take for granted. But perhaps the greatest lesson we can take from the history of medieval food is one of gratitude and perspective. For all the hardships and privations of the past, people still found ways to come together over a shared meal, to celebrate the simple joys of flavor and fellowship. They remind us that food is more than just fuel for our bodies. It is a source of comfort, of connection, of culture and identity. So the next time you sit down to a warm, nourishing meal, take a moment to savor the flavors and textures, to appreciate the love and labor that went into its preparation. Take a moment to give thanks for the abundance and variety that surrounds us, and to remember those who came before us, who struggled and survived on so much less. And most of all, take a moment to cherish the simple joy of breaking bread with those we love, of coming together in communion and community. For in the end, that is what food is all about. Not just sustenance for the body, but nourishment for the soul. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the fascinating and often fraught history of medieval food. I hope that these tales of hunger and hardship, of feasting and fellowship, have filled your dreams with a new appreciation for the simple pleasures of the table. May you always have a warm hearth and a full belly, and may the echoes of the past never be far from your thoughts as you drift off to sleep. Good night, dear listener, and bon appétit. The wealthy dined in opulence while the poor starved, but even the rich weren't always safe from the hazards lurking in their food. The gluttony of the upper classes was on full display at their lavish banquets, where enormous meals with exotic delicacies were the norm. Kings and nobles would think nothing of feasting on a hearty soup called mortrue, made from the ground-up innards of fish and spiced with sugar and saffron. This might be followed by a roast peacock, its colourful feathers carefully replaced after cooking to impress the guests. Other popular dishes included lampreys, a rather gruesome-looking eel-like fish, and meat jellies called subtleties. These lavish meals were a stark contrast to the meagre rations of the lower classes. One royal who was particularly notorious for his enormous appetite was King Henry VIII of England. He was said to have a prodigious appetite, often eating a large quantity of meat at every meal. His favourite dish was supposedly a meat pie containing venison, veal, and wild boar. He would wash all this down with up to 8 pints of ale a day. As he grew older and more corpulent, he only became more indulgent in his tastes. It's said that he became so large that he had to be winched onto his horse with a crane. But Henry was far from the only royal glutton. King Louis VI of France was called Louis the Fat. For good reason. He was so large that he couldn't mount a horse and had to be carted around in a wagon instead. And then there was King Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, who would regularly drink himself into a stupor. One night, he supposedly fell into a drunken rage. and ordered his cook to be roasted alive on a spit after finding a fly in his soup. The Catholic Church officially condemned gluttony as one of the 7 deadly sins, but in practice, they often looked the other way when it came to the indulgences of the upper class. Many monks and clergymen were quite fond of their food and drink as well. It was not uncommon for monasteries to have lax regulations around fasting. Meanwhile, the lower classes were harshly judged for any small luxury. In 1457, a London baker was pilloried for selling pies that contained venison, a food that was considered the exclusive right of the nobility to consume. All of this excess existed alongside the constant threat of food scarcity and famine. Malnutrition was so common among the lower classes that it's believed the average medieval peasant was a full 2 to 3 inches shorter than we are today. Most only lived to be around 30 years old. Meanwhile, at the lavish feasts of the rich, mountains of half-eaten food were regularly dumped into the garbage. The poor sanitation and lack of hygiene in food preparation would eventually come back to bite the upper classes as well. Rotten and contaminated ingredients often made it into the dishes served at banquets. Food poisoning was so common that many castles employed official food tasters whose job was to sample each dish before it was served to check for obvious spoilage or poison. But this only caught the most egregious hazards. People regularly became sick and even died from foodborne illnesses. And they had little understanding of the danger, often attributing such maladies to curses, bad humours, or God's will. Concepts of food safety were very primitive. Cooks worked in cramped, dark and dirty castle kitchens. Rats and insects were often mixed into the food stores. The widespread use of lead glazes in cooking pots slowly poisoned people over time. And the complete lack of refrigeration meant that meat and dairy quickly spoiled. The upper class's desire for the freshest possible ingredients led to some rather unsavoury practices. Calves and pigs were sometimes cut open while still alive so that the meat could be cooked immediately. Eels might be skinned and sliced while still wriggling. Such cruelties were overlooked in the pursuit of culinary perfection. But even with all their wealth and power, the rich couldn't escape the greatest scourge of the Middle Ages, the Black Death. The plague ravaged Europe in the 14th century, wiping out 1/3 of the population. It spread in part through contaminated food sources, like infected beef and grains infested with fleas. The insidious disease didn't care if you were a prince or a pauper. It cut down both the mightiest kings and lowliest serfs. Before he himself succumbed, King Alfonso XI of Castile lost his beloved wife and son to the plague. Across Europe, over 75 million people perished. The societal upheaval and labour shortages that followed only exacerbated the already dire food situation. In the aftermath, some of the ruling class tried to pass laws to keep the hungry masses in check. King Edward III of England issued an ordinance in 1349 that forbade commoners from indulging in fine meals. Item, for the outrageous and excessive multitude of meats and dishes which the great men of the kingdom have used and still use in their castles, it read, "It is ordained that no man, of what estate or condition soever he be, shall be served at dinner or supper, or at any other time, with more than 2 courses, and each mess of 2 sorts of victuals at the utmost, be it of flesh or fish, with the common sorts of pottages, without sauce or any other sort of victuals." In other words, 2 courses only, no fancy sauces, and don't even think about a 3rd entree. The plague years were a time of immense suffering across the social spectrum. But in the end, the wealthy still had a better chance of surviving a famine than the poor. They might have to cut back on their feasting and make do with cold meat pies, but a cold meat pie was still better than slow starvation. No such laws were needed to restrict the diets of the lower classes. The constant spectre of scarcity did that for them. As the Middle Ages drew to a close and the early modern period began, European food culture started to slowly transform. Global trade brought new spices, fruits and vegetables to the continent. Cookbooks and proper cutlery became more widespread. The Renaissance saw a flowering of the arts, culture, and also cuisine. But the medieval mindset around food lingered for a long time. The sin of gluttony still applied far more to the poor than the rich. Food was still a precarious resource for most people, balanced between paucity and peril. And the enormous inequalities on the dinner table reflected the social hierarchy entrenched in society as a whole. So the next time you sit down to a simple, balanced, healthy meal, take a moment to savor it. Appreciate the varieties of fresh ingredients from all around the world, free from contamination and lovingly prepared. Enjoy it on your clean, smooth plate with a knife and fork. Relish the nutrition it provides and the energy it gives you, and be grateful that you will likely never experience the hunger and hardship that was the constant companion of our medieval ancestors. For them, food was not a joy, but a jeopardy, a battleground between scarcity and safety that defined much of their difficult lives. To eat as we do today would have been an impossible dream. As the Black Death subsided and the population slowly recovered, food supplies gradually stabilized as well. Farmers could once again tend to their crops without fear of disease, and markets bustled with the renewed trade of grains, vegetables, and livestock. But the spectre of the plague lingered in the memories and habits of medieval Europeans for generations. Many continued to avoid fresh fruits and vegetables, believing them to be dangerous to health. Spices were used even more liberally to mask the taste of spoiled meat, and the wealthy clung to their elaborate dining rituals as a way to assert their status in an uncertain world. Amidst this tenuous stability, a new era of culinary experimentation began to emerge. Cooks in noble households started to develop more sophisticated recipes, combining local ingredients with exotic spices in novel ways. Dishes like blancmange, a savory pudding of chicken, rice and almond milk, and marzipan, a sweet paste of ground almonds and sugar, became fashionable among the upper classes. At the same time, the increased availability of sugar from the Arab world and the Americas began to transform European taste preferences. Previously, a rare luxury reserved for medicines, sugar was now being used to sweeten all manner of foods and drinks. Candied fruits, sugared almonds, and honeyed cakes became popular delicacies in wealthy households. But sugar also became a symbol of the growing divide between the rich and the poor. While the nobility indulged their sweet tooth, most commoners still struggled to afford even basic staples like bread and pottage. The extravagant sugar sculptures and confections that adorned aristocratic banquet tables were a world away from the hard-scrabble diets of the peasantry. This gulf between the haves and the have-nots would only continue to widen in the centuries to come as global trade expanded and new foods flooded the European market. But for the medieval poor, these distant delicacies remained tantalizingly out of reach. For them, food remained an uncertain necessity, a daily struggle to stave off hunger with whatever meager scraps they could obtain. As we come to the end of our journey through the often grim and unappetizing history of food in medieval Europe, it's worth reflecting on just how far we've come. Today, we take for granted the incredible variety, quality, and convenience of the food at our fingertips. We can savor flavors from every corner of the globe without ever leaving our own kitchens. And for most of us, the spectre of hunger is a distant memory, not a daily reality. So the next time you sit down to a warm, abundant meal, take a moment to savor not just the taste, but the centuries of struggle and hardship that brought us to this point. And spare a thought for the medieval peasant, huddled over a thin gruel of old vegetables and stale bread, dreaming of a world where food was not just a means of survival, but a source of joy and comfort. And with that, we come to the end of our boring history of medieval food. I hope you've enjoyed this little culinary journey through time, and that it's helped you drift off into a peaceful slumber. If you did find it relaxing, a like or subscribe would mean the world to me. But no pressure, I'm just happy to have kept you company as you dozed off. Sweet dreams and bon appétit.